thank you all for coming here. I have my little boy band mic on tonight, so I'll try not to break into any kind of, and then just stay there, dance or song. But I am going to talk about, I'm writing a novel, and it's a mystery novel. And so what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about my process of writing that novel and where the idea comes from. And because it is a mystery, and there is a murder in the mystery, and the case that inspired this book is essentially like a true crime thing. So that there will be a little bit of a discussion of murder, essentially. So nothing graphic, but just so you all know. So this is Bubba, the yellow lab that you'll learn a little bit about tonight. But so research is just as important for artists of all kinds as it is for people in any other field, whether that's sciences or social sciences. It's an essential component for creative work. And so today I'll talk a little bit about what research looks like for writers and for other creative people. And I think a big part of it for me is the idea of following the energy to find the seeds of a story, so that the research essentially inspires the story that you're writing. And so the question here is, how did the little detective and a dog named Bubba, that dog's name really is Bubba, inspire the novel that I'm writing? So a little bit about the book that I'm working on. Very much in progress. The working title is Gigantic, and Gigantic is a feminist thriller, and it's set in the Roaring Fork Valley on Colorado's western slope. And that's actually where I grew up. I have a lot of love and affection for that place. There's also a lot of tension, I think, and as a writer, you always need to look for, like, what's that source of tension and what's that source of conflict. And it's also a place I know really well. So for me, making the choice to set something in a place that I was familiar with and can kind of imagine around was really, I think, has been beneficial for me, because there's so many other things that I'm creating. So it just sort of helps me balance out the things that I have to, I guess, like, make up with things that I can borrow from real life, essentially. And so Gigantic tells the story of the murder of Anna Welch and what the investigation of her murder reveals about generations of corruption in a small town in Colorado. And Gigantic is told from the voices of women impacted by Anna's murder, including Anna's sister-in-law, Nell. And so after Anna is murdered and her brother is accused of the crime, Nell is pulled back to the town her family had called home and ruled over for generations. And she's caught between grief for her friend and exonerating her brother. And in the process, she's forced to confront what she's left behind. So that's kind of a little bit about the novel. I probably won't go into too much detail. I have a little bit of that writer suspicion, I think, about something that's in progress. Like, if you talk about it too much, it might go away. So I am not just interested in this story. Like, I write because I'm so interested in people's interiors, and I'm interested in the dynamics between people and their relationships with one another. But I'm also really interested in big questions and big issues. And so this story is also about violence against women. It's about the intersections between patriarchy and capitalism. And I think, the issues that I'm trying to explore through this story, I think, are the issues that of a lot of women. And the novel considers how shame and betrayal can impact us for generations. But when I started this story, I had a setting. As I talked about before, I had themes, I had sort of a general idea, but there were some really big things missing. And so I actually wrote and rewrote this story several times in different forms and different genres. It started as just like a straight sort of literary realism, which is really my training from my graduate work. But that wasn't going anywhere, and like there was just like no momentum in the story. And I think sometimes you know when something has juice, I guess, but you're just going the wrong direction. But sometimes you know that there's just like the story is flat. And I just sort of knew that. And I think I wrote a couple hundred pages and was just like, this is not doing what I can't get this to do what I want it to do. And then I thought, okay, I think I'm going to write a young adult novel. I think I could get to these same sort of general themes as a YA book. And then I realized, like, I love young adult fiction, but young adult fiction is about immediacy. A lot of it is written in the first person present tense because it mimics the developmental stage of the audience of the books. And that's not necessarily what I'm interested in as a writer. Like, I'm really interested in like linearity, like moving back and forth in time, and like the way the past informs the present, and the way the present will inform the future. And that's not necessarily effective within that space. And so I knew what I was missing was like a story and a structure and essentially a genre. And all of those things are containers for ideas. So enter Alex Murdaugh. And I guess I should, before we go further with talking about this family, this is a low country South Carolina dynasty. And I think I came into this thinking as a Coloradan that you would say Murdaugh, but they pronounce it Murdoch. So I'll use that pronunciation throughout the rest of this. Alex Murdaugh, Alec Murdaugh. And I don't have a South Carolinian accent, but so enter Alex Murdaugh, who's there in that photo. The unraveling of the Murdaugh family dynasty and the deaths of Maggie and Paul. And so some of you might be aware of this trial. There's been some podcasts, documentary films, including one on Netflix, one on HBO. It's a pretty salacious case, and so on. And if you're not, a little bit of background on a very complex case. So in June of 2021, Maggie Murdaugh and her 22-year-old son, Paul, were brutally murdered near their family estate, Moselle, in the low country of South Carolina. And they were murdered near the family's kennels. And Alex Murdaugh, the family patriarch and member of this dynasty, was accused and later convicted of murdering his own wife and son. And Murdaugh, a personal attorney who also practiced law in the firm that bore his family's name, was indicted and convicted of stealing millions of dollars of settlement money from his clients. Many of whom were not wealthy people who a member of the family had been, either killed or left unable to work in an accident, and who had received a very large settlement to be able to help them, continue paying their bills and things like that. And he stole that money too. So that's condensing a very complicated family and a very complicated case. But this case provided the seed for the story and the structure of the novel that I'm working on. And so I discovered this case. I kind of fell into it about a week before the trial began. And, I think like a lot of people get notifications on my phone from various publications, and I got a notification on my phone from the New York Times of an article that was about this group of dogged journalists who had investigated Alex Murdaugh and kind of brought to light a lot of the things that were happening, and had really made some connections about his possible guilt or relationship to these murders. And I also learned reading this article that the trial had been live streamed. And I don't really consider myself like a true crime fan. I think true crime can be a little, problematic in the way it represents like real pain that people experience. But, for some reason, and I still am like, I'm not sure why I, decided to like follow this trial. And I guess I'd just say, like, some maybe sort of weird synchronicity or a writer's hunch. The first day of the trial, I tuned in and I watched it. I think I watched it on my phone when I was like on my smart trainer working out. And I just kept watching and watching and watching. And then because I am that person, then I started listening to several daily podcasts that were recapping each day of the trial. And a couple of those podcasts were hosted by people who are low country journalists. So I started learning a little bit about this culture and the relationships between people in this very small town where this family had sort of like ruled for generations, and people were pretty terrified of them and what they might do. And so at some point I sort of realized that I was, I would like be at school and then I would go home and I would watch the day's trial, and there were like certain testimonies I would watch over and over and over. And I guess I was, what I would say, I was like down the rabbit hole. Or, I later titled an Honors 300 class I teach in the summer, Following the Energy. And so that's what I was doing. I just didn't really understand why. And the trial had all of these just wild, made for TV, almost like too strange for like the truth is stranger than fiction moments. For example, and there's not a photo of this, unfortunately, but Paul Murdaugh, who was murdered, and his family had nicknamed him the Little Detective, and he solved his own murder essentially by testifying from beyond the grave in a video he'd attempted to send his friend Rogan of Rogan's puppy Cash, but that wasn't recovered until investigators were able to crack the password on his phone, which was his birthday, by the way. So weird. Yeah, so they finally tried Paul's birthday, and they were able to get into the phone. I think they had like one try left before it erased itself forever, which is also just kind of a weird little thing. But so on this video of this dog, Paul, Maggie, and Alex's voices are clearly audible, and the video's time-stamped placed Alex at the scene of the crime minutes before the murders, and it also just shredded his alibi. And one of Alex's former law partners, a witness for the defense, like switched sides during the redirect because he started seeing that just the evidence was too compelling of what was happening here. Buster Murdaugh, who's over there in that bottom photo with the red hair, he was disciplined for appearing to flip the bird to Mark Tinsley, who's up at the top, who was essentially revealed how helped like solidify the potential motive for the murders. And in that, Mark Tinsley's another murder. And then the Murdaugh family was moved farther back in the courtroom after Alex's sister handed him a John Grisham novel during the trial. So all of these things that you think how can this possibly be? How can this be reality? How can this possibly be happening? Somebody must be writing this somewhere. And then the eggs here. So one of the jurors was removed for unethical conduct, and when the judge at the beginning of that day's trial said, without giving details, said like this person was going to be removed, they asked for their eggs before they could leave the courtroom because one of the other jurors had given them eggs from their chicken. So this person, those are the eggs, and they're labeled with the juror number, and that person became known as the egg lady juror. So, I mean, to me, I was like, this is too strange. And so I was obviously very intrigued in this case for, number one, to find out like what would happen, what decision would the jury make, but also just because these things, wilder and wilder things kept happening. And because South Carolina is a small place, this is a small town, a small county, I mean, the prosecuting attorney and the defendant went to the same law school and were even in law school at the same time. So these people all knew each other, and that just kind of made it more compelling too. But that's still not necessarily a story. However, I started to see some patterns as I watched this. And one of the patterns that I saw is the bravery of the trial's women witnesses. And there are 3 of them right here. And these are women who stood up against this powerful family to share their truth. So the woman up at the top who's wiping her eyes, her name is Blanca, and Blanca Simpson, she was the family's housekeeper, and she testified that Alex had changed clothes on the night of the murder, but had told her, like, oh, you remember I did not change my clothes, in an attempt to try to keep her quiet. And also testified that Maggie had revealed that there were problems in the marriage and that she knew that Alex was keeping something big from her, and that Alex had specifically invited her back to Moselle the night of the murders, even though she was at a small beach community and didn't want to go, that he really insisted that she come. Shelley Smith, who isn't pictured here, was the nighttime caregiver for Alex's mother, who had dementia. And she was important in helping to demonstrate that Alex's alibi was not rock solid. And she also testified that Alex had essentially threatened her with if she did not sort of follow the story that he had for his alibi. This is Dr. Ellen Reamer, who is I think I sort of felt a little bit of maybe solidarity with her too as a professor, a female professor, but she was the pathologist and testified to the crime and really stood up against the defense attorney, Dick Harpootlian, who was just really sort of like hammering her and trying to discredit her and discredit her experience and knowledge. And she just really stood her ground. And then the woman at the bottom is her name is Marion, and she was Maggie Murdoch's sister. And she testified she had not really spoken out after her sister was killed. And she testified that Alex hadn't seemed concerned about the killer and told her whoever did this had been thinking about it for a long time. And another pattern that I started seeing too was the family's influence and how Alex had essentially brought the reign of his family's influence in Hampton County to a close. But I didn't realize why these patterns mattered to me and why I was so sort of, I think, obsessed in a way with this case until Creighton Waters, the defense attorney, cross-examined Alex Murdaugh. And it's pretty, generally it is not recommended for a defendant to take the stand because there are just so many things that can go wrong, right? Particularly when so many things are on the line, in a double murder trial. If the jury doesn't perceive you, if the jury doesn't perceive you well, if the prosecutor is able to poke holes in any of your story, that can really be, have a bad outcome for you, essentially. But, Alex, who's pretty narcissistic and also who, I think probably felt really compelled, like he needed to take the stand in order to explain the false alibi that he had provided and that he had essentially lied. He ended up taking the stand, and it was really this compelling. It was very compelling to watch these two people sort of facing off, both of them very intelligent, both of them very intense. And I chose these 3 photos up here because that's Creighton Waters, who is the DA, the prosecuting attorney. And he and Alex went to the same law school, but, they chose very different paths. As a DA, Creighton Waters did not have the same sort of economic status as Alec Murdaugh. And as just an aside and one of those strange things, he's also a metalhead and a guitarist on the weekends. But it was a really, really I think, compelling thing to watch. And I love that photo there, which just shows like the exhaustion that these people felt trying to like essentially do what they thought was fighting for justice. But there was a moment during this cross-examine where Creighton Waters, the prosecuting attorney, said, I asked this before, but shame for you is an extraordinary provocation, isn't it, Mr. Murdoch? And he replies, shame for me is an extraordinary provocation. I don't like to be shamed. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, there it is. There's the seed. There's the seed for my story right there. That idea, right? What will your fear of being shamed drive you to do? And what does that mean for the people around you? However, the Murdoch trial still raised more questions for me than were answered in the conviction, and he was convicted of murdering his wife and son, and was sentenced to life in prison. And I think, what I started thinking about is, I've always been interested in family dynamics and small town dynamics. And part of that is just that, like, I have a very large family. I grew up in a small town. And I'm just, like, endlessly fascinated about those, I think, like, complications and complexities of family. And I started just asking, I think, big questions after watching this, like what would compel someone to take the lives of their own, wife and child? What would it take to testify against your brother-in-law? And I kept thinking of like Buster Murdoch. I mean, these names are crazy. What would you do if it was your father or your brother who committed these crimes? Like, what is that? How do you wrestle with that in your mind? How do you move forward from that? And, how are power and shame intertwined? And how are they passed down through generations? And, I just started thinking about all those things. And, just to, I think, back up for a second, before the jury deliberations, the jury and the attorneys and the judge, they visited Moselle, which is the scene of the crimes, and it was this big, sprawling estate. And so this was in, late February. And so you can kind of see that, things are just sort of growing back after the winter. And it's this beautiful sort of lots of contradictions, right? Like beautiful green place, but that is, gated so that you can't enter. There were 2 journalists from the journalist pool that got to go along to see Moselle, and then they published the photojournalists' photos. And later, I also read the account from the journalist about her trip there. But when I looked at the photos that day, like, I mean, I really, really did get chills seeing those photos. And later read that, like, the journalist said that observing the jury and later talking to members of the jury, that going there helped them just sort of understand that, yeah, this is what happened. Even in just seeing those photos, the place's weight was very clear to me. And Moselle, heavy with pain, encumbered by sorrow, burdened with fear and blood and memory. And so those photos and that sensation, they ended up inspiring the prologue to my novel. And even though what I'm writing is not a replication of, it's not a fictionalization of this story, this experience, and I think just thinking about these big questions and the dynamics between people in a family, and the idea that places remember, and places can carry the weight of generations of conflict and complexity, helped inspire the story that I was writing and give it a shape that had really been missing. And in a podcast I listened to, I found this quote, and I wrote it down. It's on a sticky note. It's like close to where I write when I write. And this is, I think, helping me to kind of think about like the theme that's behind the interaction between these characters. So, and this is from Jung, where love is absent, power fills the vacuum. And this, has other applications too. So I've been thinking about this a lot. But so I had a story and a structure, but there was like one thing missing. And that thing was that I did not know. I knew I was writing a mystery, like a thriller / mystery, but I did not know how to write one. And so what do you do if you know that you should be writing in some genre, but you have not written in that genre? Well, for me as a writer, the second part of my research, like there's research for content, but there's also research for craft. So writers are readers, just like artists are technicians and look at other artists' techniques. And so what I started doing was just reading as many mysteries and thrillers of as many kinds as I possibly could. And when you read for craft, or when you read like a writer, you're not just reading for the story and for like sort of the pleasure of engaging in a story. You're reading to see what, like essentially how the thing is built. So what are the techniques that the writer is using? How is the writer using them? And why might they be using them? And I think this is something you learn. I do this with my undergraduates, but for me, this was something that I was taught how to do during my master's program. And it's like this little switch that flipped in my brain. And then now I always have the pleasure of not only like reading to enjoy a story, but also to read to see like, well, how is this thing put together? Which is just sort of endlessly fun for me. So, as I was reading, I was looking for, what's the structure? How are the arcs of the characters developed? How do writers create misdirection or red herrings? How do they plant the clues that sort of lodge in your brain, but they don't necessarily understand why that's there until later? And essentially, I think I was also looking for, how does a writer write a compelling story with big themes without sacrificing the story itself and like the sort of thing that makes you want to turn the pages and learn more. And so these are some of the, I think standout books for me. I have some questions for you by Rebecca Mackay. And I would recommend these to any of you. Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. And what was interesting to me about this book is that there's there's a lot of courtroom scenes. And that, I think I learned a lot about like, how do you actually write a courtroom scene without it dragging the story down? Because there's a lot of like time in a courtroom, which can seem kind of boring. And she was a trial attorney before she became a writer. So that was interesting to me. The Girls by Emma Cline is a retelling of the Manson story. And that is not necessarily like maybe a true, thriller like the next book next to it, Better the Blood is. But that's a very much like female-driven story, very character-driven, and really great at developing like very good tension and kind of darkness. And then Better the Blood is a straight up thriller by a writer who is a screenwriter, and I thought that was a really interesting book for me to learn from his sort of like cinematic use of the narrative perspective. And what I think is interesting too about Better the Blood, it's set in New Zealand, and Michael Bennett is a Maori writer, and it's the very first female Maori detective in fiction, and it's a absolutely fantastic book. And then one more slide of books, just because I think it's great to share recommendations. But I think The God of the Woods by Liz Moore, excellent, I guess you would call like a literary thriller. Probably, I think, my favorite book that I've read this year. The Secret History by Donna Tartt is sort of a classic dark academia mystery set on a college campus. S.A. Cosby is one of, I think, the best crime writers we have writing today. And that was a really great book for me because it's set in a small town. He really gets into small town dynamics. And then finally, Lucy Foley, who's a UK writer, in writing in the vein of Agatha Christie in the locked room, closed room mysteries, but is writing these stories and also getting into big themes of gender, gender and class and race too. So, I learned all these from these books, but I think this is true for lots of writers and artists, and frankly for anyone doing research, that it is really fun to do the research, right? And it's like you can just sort of, there's like the trails you can go down and the excuses you can make that you just need to read like one more book before you get started, or watch one more thing. Or, oh, wow, I really should look at this podcast, or maybe I should make a playlist. You could sort of do that for a very long time, but eventually the research has to stop, and so the writing can begin. And that doesn't mean you're not still reading at the same time, but you really do have to at some point actually engage in the actual writing process, which is, much more work in lots of ways, and a little harder, maybe a little harder on the soul. But I put this photo up here. This is Mullis Pass, because this does not always happen. And if you waited for like a nice little moment of inspiration to happen as an artist, you wouldn't get any work done at all. But I was lucky enough to be driving from Glenwood, my hometown, back to Durango last summer, and I just heard the first line of that prologue, and I just kept hearing it over and over and over. And when you hear that, not to sound a little squishy, but when you hear that, you do need to pay attention. And so when I got home, I unpacked my car, I sat down, and it the first 4 pages just poured out. And I think for me, that was how I think I knew that I was doing something, I had found the right sort of structure and genre for the story I wanted to tell, because there was really, I think, that energy behind it for me to follow. And I think as soon as I kind of listened to that and just let myself go down those strange, odd trails, and just without asking questions, I think, and being curious about why I was going in those directions, but not worrying too much about what the outcome was going to be, that's when I think things opened up for me. And that doesn't mean that finishing this thing is not going to be difficult or hard, or there are not going to be places where I get stuck, but I do feel like I can trust that I'm going in the right direction. And I think, as a teacher, I think these experiences in this process also, they certainly help me work with students, but I think this has also helped kind of inspire some of the maybe exercises or activities I do with students. And, I have been teaching an honors class that is called Follow the Energy, that the students really enjoy. And our focus in that is really about the process and the curiosity and in sort of engaging in research, and not as much about worrying about the product. Because sometimes when we worry so much about this thing over here being, perfect and good and whatever, and thinking that it should be this, then we are missing the real sort of thing that makes something come alive and interesting, not just for us, but also for, readers or viewers or et cetera. So I'll close with some tips for your own work. And certainly this applies, I think, most closely to creative work, but I think it can apply to all kinds of things. So first is the idea of following the trails. So follow that energy, go where your interests are, go where you see something buzzing a little bit. The second is details matter. So part of the reason that I talked about the egg lady juror and, Alex's sister slipping him that John Grisham novel is because of that specificity. And specificity particularly matters in art of all kinds, but it also matters for anything you're going to do, right? If you are researching a virus or researching a flower or something like that, you need to be specific. The details really matter, and the details, I think, allow you to figure out where your space is in this area. 3 is to vary your sources. And I mean, for me, doing something creative, I mean, you know, and this is where maybe things are a little different from the sciences. I mean, like, I did go to lots of Reddits, and I had not spent a lot of time on Reddits. I'm old. But I was like, wow, there's a lot of interesting things here that happen here. But I mean, that to me was like hearing real people talk about this. And I found a Reddit that was moderated by someone who lived in Hampton County, and I got a little inside baseball there. And, you know, I just felt like reading articles, watching the trial, reading books, listening to podcasts, like, all of those different things for me just helped me build a world, which is what you're really trying to do when you're writing. Let it percolate. So, I mean, again, like, I just sort of had to let myself kind of be comfortable with not knowing where I was going with all of this, and kind of wondering, like, is there something wrong with me that I'm like so focused on this and interested in this? But, you know, I just sort of had to let it germinate together and see what would appear. And then this last thing goes back to the last thing I discussed. More is more until it's too much. So know when to what is that? Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, whatever. Know when to walk away. I probably just mangled that. But know when it's time to, like, you know, no more going to the Reddit, and actually you got to sit down and do some work and do the writing. So, all right, and that is it. So thank you so much for coming.